Hi, I'm Eugene Reichel. I'm the director of the Center for East European and Russian Duration Studies, or CEERES for short. And I'd like to welcome you to the CEERES Director's Lecture. Today's lecture is sponsored by CEERES with generous support from the U.S. Department of Education Title VI National Research Center grants. We'll have time for Q&A after the talk. And for those of us joining us remotely, please use the Q&A box in Zoom to enter your questions anytime throughout the talk. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce our director's lecturer. Oh, I'm sorry, I should put this off and be clear. Dora Vargha, professor of history and medical humanities based jointly at Humboldt University in Berlin and at the University of Exeter. She's a historian of medicine, science, and technology whose work focuses on questions of global health and biomedical research in the Cold War era, using the locality of Eastern Europe as a starting point. She's author of Polio Across the Iron Curtain, Hungary's Cold War with an Epidemic, published in 2018 by Cambridge University Press. She's also written on the global infrastructure of diphtheria antitoxin, the politics of vaccination in Eastern Europe, hospital care of disabled children in communist contexts, and about shifting epidemic narratives in historical analysis, which we'll be hearing about today. He's currently working on 2 research projects exploring alternative approaches to the history of global health. Socialist Medicine and Alternative Global Health History, funded by an ERC starting grant, investigates the role of socialist world in global health structures and networks, and Connecting Three Worlds, a collaborative Wellcome Trust-funded project exploring socialist networks and public health technical assistance.
As I arrived, the mask mandate was lifted on to consider. What I did not expect at that time was that my thoughts will also be occupied by a terrible war. As an Eastern European with a Hungarian grandfather born as what is now on the territory of Ukraine, then taken for 4 years to Siberian work camp after World War II, and with my mother's otherwise very entertaining stories of a university exchange trip to Kharkiv and Donbass in the 1970s, this conflict is hitting particularly close to home. Although I'm a historian of Cold War, as well as a historian of medicine, I'm not a specialist of Russian, Ukrainian, Soviet, or post-Soviet history, nor would I want to join the newly minted experts who are coming out of the woodwork to provide their hot take on what is going on, similarly to the ones who appeared in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. I cannot, however, in good conscience ignore this in this talk on epidemics, what is happening in Ukraine, especially since the two, pandemic and war, has become intertwined in ways that were mostly theoretical, had more theoretical significance beforehand. In what follows, I will retain focus on my original intent for this talk, but I will also offer initial thoughts to grapple with this dual crisis. So apologies if those bits are not extremely polished, but this is happening as we speak. I began thinking about epidemic endings well before the current pandemic started, as Eugene knows very well. It began by standing in line for immigration at New York Airport. So I had about an hour, hour and a half to contemplate the poster that you can see here that was looking down at me from the wall. In Rotary's ad campaign, people from Desmond Tutu to Jackie Chan, who you can see here, were showing how close to the end of polio we are. There was even a Gangnam Style version of the ad, if somebody remembers still what that was. It was a long time ago. The message was that the end is in sight. We are very close, this close, and we just need one last push to the end of the disease targeted by a global eradication program. The ad looks great. You stop and look and perhaps even donate to the cause. But at the same time, it is also terribly disturbing. What are these people showing us? What exactly is the end of polio and what comes after? Upon closer inspection, these images open broader questions of how we think about epidemics, disease, and solving a public health problem. This image tells us a particular story about polio and represents a particular understanding of the disease. In the finish line of eradication, mind you, we have been in the finish line for 20 years now with polio, Gone are the clinical complexities of the disease itself, the therapeutical regimes, the contestations and negotiations, the paralyzed bodies, the fears of parents. Polio, in this understanding, in the very end, is reduced to a virus, a mere pathogen. Whether in scientific publications, health communication, or charity drives, the disease is exclusively talked about in relation to vaccination and to the particular wild strains that are in circulation somewhere in the world. The end that Jackie Chan and otherwise Bill Gates and the others are showing us is the end of the virus, not the disease. This was particularly striking to me as I was queuing still, because I had just come from conducting interviews with former polio patients in Hungary, for whom the disease was far from over, even though there hadn't been an outbreak where I was coming from for half a century. Polio had effectively ended in Hungary in 1959, and funds pulled out of treatment and long-term care shortly after. And in 1963, a specialized polio hospital was transformed into a general pediatric hospital. Done and dusted, the terrifying epidemics became past. For people with often visible disability, which could span from the total incapacity of movement, including muscles needed for breathing, to slight weakness in one of the limbs, this was not the case, however. They kept living with the disease very much present in their lives, but with less and less resources and support from the state that had shifted attention away as the acute became chronic. Their story is markedly different, and their lives are not part of the ending that the posters communicate. How we understand epidemic narratives and endings matters greatly, both in the here and now and historically. As we piece together past pandemics, together with past actors' imaginations of the future to come, and in turn imagine the future of the current one, we build our own narratives. The most famous of epidemic narratives is Charles Rosenberg's concept of the epidemic dramaturgy, which sets out the epidemics as plays in 3 acts. Act 1 is the progressive revelation, as it comes to light that there is an epidemic unfolding. Act 2 is managing randomness. That means basically the collective agreement on the framework and rationalizing the epidemic. And Act 3 is negotiating public response. In Rosenberg's understanding, the epidemic ends with a whimper as victims die, they flee, they recover, and incidence rates decline. He sees this ending as inevitable. The lack of much critical engagement with this ending is somewhat troubling on this stage, where this drama takes place, and one wonders where actors and spectators, what they do when the curtain comes down. Constructing narratives of epidemics is not merely an intellectual or philosophical problem, however. As my colleague, literary scholar Arthur Rose pointed out, the major difference between literary and historical narratives, crudely put, is dead bodies. There is a fundamental reality that pulls us into place and anchors however we frame our narratives. People dying in hospitals across the world in COVID-19, however small their number, will be no less dead by the end of the day, regardless of the declaration of ending by public health authorities, governments, or the rather dangerous pushing of a particular understanding of the endemic. In epidemic narratives, because of their stake in death, we aim to construct a historical reflection. Cyclical and linear time becomes jumbled, and we can often find ourselves in a bind as we navigate the particularities of the epidemic, the here and now, and the recurring familiarity of the beginning, crisis, and end, common features of epidemic past. This brings us to the question of historical epidemic suitability as pointers. If there's some kind of overarching pattern that we can identify, or if every epidemic is a unique event that is lodged in space and time, social, political, and cultural and economic contexts, with varying medical infrastructure, knowledge, involving diverse diseases. The narrative of beginning, crisis, and end has a clear function, however, to serve as a thread to organize experiences and expectations around. It is a seductive narrative that pulls us in with its familiarity. The bell curve that we're all so familiar with is like a roller coaster. We brace ourselves on the way upwards and prepare all kinds of responses, similarly to the way that Rosenberg points out, to the worst that is yet to come, knowing that there will be a downward slope, and eventually, we can get off the ride. It is important then to be conscious of the work that the narrative performs, but to also question its assumptions. The prospect of an ending fuels treatment and vaccine development, eradication programs, and provides hope and coping mechanisms for societies and individuals in epidemics. The narrative arc is also an escape from the suspended time or even timelessness of epidemic crisis that we are all, again, familiar with, providing structure to an unstructured temporal existence, and at the same time filled with temporal tensions of crisis and individual situations. At the same time, the seductive nature of the narrative is exactly its trap, providing a relatively neat framework that does not necessarily accommodate the multiplicity of the epidemic experience. Epidemic endings, messiness, or its outright impossibility may render certain actors invisible or push them out of the narrative, create frustration, inequalities, and might entrench severe public health problems. Epidemics are, as Rosenberg reminds us, episodic events. In between waves, we have relief, we forget, so there's a conscious and unconscious forgetting of epidemic times. There's celebration and recovery, a kind of return to normality, as we can put it, or we like to put it. But the episodes are also often connected through the victims' families, and provide fears of recovering patients. So the imprint on bodies, the infrastructure in place, the posters, the everything that around us that remind us of the peak, fears of a new outbreak, and the crisis moments that we're still preparing for potentially. There's an underlying continuity and persistence that carries forward episodic moments long after they pass. In some cases, specialized hospitals and wards continue to operate, as was the case in between polio summers, for instance, with the polio epidemic. And vaccination campaigns, this is very particularly important for vaccination campaigns that use the reminders of outbreaks and as references to new potential ones to get people to take up the vaccine. This continuity is upheld for a while, even epidemic waves cease to return. Then structures that had been bound to the events that happen no more disappear or transform, sometimes with tragic consequences for members of society for whom the epidemic is far from over. Scientific narratives then, focusing on pathogen and epidemiological aspects, and I refer back to our friend Jackie Chan here, alone carry the risk of erasing actors, processes, and the weight of declaration of ending. They are, as Theodore Porter put it, real technologies of distance, rendering legible an incredibly complex set of information, making them transportable across fields, languages, and cultures. Thus, the curves also frame individual experience and expectations as people navigate the epidemic and more broadly other diseases. Epidemic language seeps through other aspects of life. Therefore, when we problematize the endings of epidemics and what happens after, we can see multiple ways in which that might affect treatment, disease, and patient experience. And we can see these kind of bell curve type of narratives of disease, applied to epidemics of obesity, epidemic of the opioid crisis, but also the individual experience of other kind of diseases that are not necessarily infectious. The need curves carry a sense of ending when the line meets the x-axis, a relief to look forward to, or at least work towards, even if that line signifies inevitable death for the individual. That line may never come, especially in the case of chronic diseases. At what point does a cancer patient cease to be a cancer patient? In a series of annual checkups and constant state of waiting if the successfully treated tumor might reemerge? What signifies the end of cancer in a suspended waiting time? And what if the epidemics carry forward that line, never reaching the axis by turning into chronic or endemic? But epidemics carry the line forward in multiple ways. HIV AIDS, of course, is particularly interesting in this regard in two ways. On the one hand, in many parts of the world, HIV is what we consider as endemic. It has not disappeared, but it also lost its fangs, so to speak. Contracting HIV is no longer an immediate death sentence and has turned into a manageable and chronic condition. Stigmas attached to it have hardly gone away, even as the representation of it, akin to polio, has transformed into colorful images of the virus we all know. On the other hand, HIV/AIDS remains a significant problem, particularly regarding severe comorbidities with TB in other parts of the world. 1.5 million people have become infected with HIV in 2020 alone, and nearly 1 million people die annually in AIDS and related diseases. One thing that becomes clear is the importance of the consideration of space, not only time. Epidemics end in certain locales when it becomes somebody else's problem, to quote Douglas Adams. SCP technology, somebody else's problem, in Adams' Life, the Universe, and Everything in A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, is used to make things like a spaceship invisible by making it somebody else's problem, in which people lose all interest in even registering the existence of the object. And I quote, "The somebody else's problem field relies on people's natural predisposition not to see anything they don't want to, weren't expecting, or can't explain," writes Adams. This is perhaps the most common way that epidemics end. May it be continuing in what is considered as far corners of the world, usually equaling to anything outside of Western Europe and North America, or in certain social groups that are disadvantaged and or discriminated against, therefore seen as unimportant. Taking the thought forward, somebody else's politics, in turn, can render histories invisible as well, calling our attention to the importance of, once again, considering space as well as time. The development of the Sabin vaccine and its use in mass vaccination campaigns from an Eastern European and socialist perspective then shifts the conventional narrative of polio eradication back almost 3 decades. The beginnings of polio eradication are usually placed in the 1980s, following the success of the global eradication of smallpox in 1978. And I'll talk about smallpox in a second. In 1988, the World Health Assembly passed a resolution to globally eradicate polio by the year 2000. And that is the poster that we saw as part of that campaign. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative has been an ongoing process without a set end date since. They kept pushing out the start date, the end date, whenever they didn't reach it, and then gave up altogether. So they just kind of in process. The WHO considered the possibility of polio eradication already in 1960, however. The third report of the Expert Committee on Poliomyelitis explicitly addressed eradication in a separate section and called on further studies to establish the possibility of polio eradication through studies. And the studies did in fact begin very soon after the publication of the report. In a paper presented at the WHO training course on poliomyelitis control held in Prague in 1961, William Škvrňák, Czechoslovakian Minister of Health, asserted that experiences with nationwide mass vaccination campaign with the Sabin vaccine justified the conclusion that in this way we shall also be able to approach most closely and most rapidly the ideal results of vaccination with live attenuated polioviruses, that is the eradication of poliomyelitis. This use of the eradication concept was much more than an empty reference to a fashionable idea of the era. This is the time of the malaria eradication campaign, just around the time that it fails, and the smallpox eradication campaign has already been suggested. In what follows, Škvrňák gave a detailed description of what was required in terms of epidemiological data collection, virological examinations, rapid vaccine administration, health services, and public communication for what he referred as, and I quote, final success. Meanwhile, the elimination and possible eradication of polio took hold, if not in global policy, but in practice. This was also reinforced in the popular representation of Eastern European eradication efforts, as a newspaper article from 1962 points out, and I quote, "The effect of the Hungarian and Czechoslovak success is becoming stronger. The European Association for Polio will meet this year in Prague to study on site the experiences that can help at once and for all get rid of this epidemic, which caused so many tragedies over millennia from the life of humanity," end quote. The success of certain national strategies in the 1960s and 70s became blueprints for the global polio eradication program in the 20th century. Countries that had been among the first to eliminate polio and were consistently using and refining the same vaccination method were particularly suited for contributing to a model of polio eradication. the way it worked is that the model of this vaccination went from Eastern Europe to Cuba with Czechoslovak and Russian collaboration. From Cuba, that model was taken up in Brazil through the national immunization days, which became very famous and eradicated polio in Brazil and became a blueprint for Latin America. And then from there traveled to the Pacific, where it was also applied. So, and this history is disappeared completely with the end of the Cold War, and where it starts is in '88 and as an American initiative and a very much philanthrocapitalist project. It is crucial then to consider what becomes a successful ending, how that comes about, and what happens after. How does the utopia of absence of disease look like, one might ask? Still with no end in sight, I'm afraid. Smallpox, the only human disease that had been eradicated, keeps on living in the back of freezers in Russia and the United States, and rogue vials sometimes resurface from rarely used lab freezers. To know the exact place of each specimen is uncomfortably uncertain. As this happens when they clean labs and find all kinds of stuff in the back. As the retainment of the specimens in the US and Russia was a Cold War deal itself, it was in a way, it was the Cold War frozen in time, waiting to resurface perhaps one day. The absence of smallpox, a horrible disease that killed many millions over the course of centuries, at once became a symbol of a successful global collaboration and the fulfillment of the promise of international health organizations, and at once perpetuates fear of biological weapons and waves of uncertainty in the trustworthiness of state-led scientific institutions in the geopolitical conflict. While the end of smallpox came with the disappearance of the pathogen itself, or at least nearly, success in eliminating disease can also bring about other kinds of disappearance. One of these factors is expertise. In the case of diseases such as polio, where the treatment involved required a complex set of skills and the combination of multiple medical specialties, knowledge was almost entirely lost. With the disappearance of epidemics, the treatment of polio disappeared from medical training. Physical therapists who specialized on polio were integrated into broader fields or redirected to other specializations. In the end, with the death of a generation of physicians and medical experts with hands-on experience of treating polio, so medical experts who have actually seen cases, former patients, people living with the disease, became the only carriers of knowledge of their condition and treatment. This in turn impacted established power relations in medical care, as patients contested the medical authority of healthcare experts. The loss of expertise can become part of what we would term as success in disease elimination. In the early 20th century, diphtheria was among one of the prime killers in childhood, even as a therapeutic was developed in the late 19th century by Emil von Behring, provided hope for treatment. And you can see here the antitoxin on that photo. A terrible disease, diphtheria, sometimes termed as a strangling angel, can kill in multiple ways by creating a pseudomembrane in the throat, leading to suffocation by blocking the airways, and by producing toxins that attack internal organs and lead to their failure and death. I mean, both are produced by the bacteria that diphtheria. Developed in the early 1920s, vaccine against diphtheria really started more widely in the 1930s and was introduced into national vaccination programs during and after World War II across the world. The success of vaccination brought the end of diphtheria into Europe and much of the world. This end came with the loss of expertise in diagnosing the disease and in the loss of routine laboratory practices, delaying the introduction of treatment significantly. What needs to happen with the diphtheria antitoxin is that it needs to be administered as soon as possible, otherwise it's too late and it cannot help. But the end also came with the withering away of biomedical infrastructure. In the case of diphtheria, the disappearance of the disease due to the successful vaccination campaigns and structures has resulted in the unavailability of therapeutics. In a combination of the withering away of state institutions, mostly in Eastern Europe, responsible for pharmaceutical production, the serum is no longer economically viable to maintain. Along with the materials, so has the expertise in diagnosis and lab work disappeared, leaving the disease that has been preventable for 90 years and treatable for well over 120 to be as deadly as it was in the mid-19th century. In the past 50 years, with the exception of a handful of countries, diphtheria, like many other vaccine-preventable diseases, moved from being a complex disease with signs and symptoms that most doctors would easily recognize in a clinical practice into an object of the microbiological past, used to make a teaching point or demonstrate biomedical progress. And we come to the reduction of the disease to a pathogen and the importance of compulsory vaccination. Reinforced by consistently low incidence rates and high vaccination coverage, this limited understanding of the disease perpetuates international and national policies that, by the turn of the 21st century, focus almost exclusively on epidemic surveillance and immunization. As a result, when cases of diphtheria do occur in Europe or the United States in the 21st century, they tend to be diagnosed too late for treatment to be effective, even if it was available. And the treatment is often not available. European states received a stark reminder of the bygone days of diphtheria epidemics when, in the early 1990s, news of an escalating outbreak started emerging from the ruins of the Soviet Union. Between 1990 and 1998, Russia and the newly independent states accounted for well over 80% of diphtheria cases worldwide, 3/4 of which were reported from Russia itself. There are several reasons why for the severe diphtheria outbreak in the former Soviet Union, but the kind of knee-jerk Cold War explanation of the dysfunctional public health system, or that kind of nothing worked in that part of the world anyway, is not one of them. Diphtheria cases plummeted and vaccination uptake was over 90% from the early 1960s onwards. And you can see here on this graph that they're kind of low, and this is the 90s. At the end, and so the epidemic surveillance system was relatively well functioning, and the vaccination became integrated into national systems after 1990. But the epidemic that swept through this region was the result of a shift in evaluating risk in public health measures and had more to do with the breakdown of a political system and the social, infrastructural, and economic crisis that ensued. A change to vaccination policy and the type of vaccines used in the 1980s coincided with a growing mistrust of the state and medical establishment and the rise of anti-vaccination movements in the wake of political reforms in the 80s. As a result, vaccination rates and immunity declined. The disbanding of 100,000 military conscripts serving in Afghanistan in 88 and 89 also might have played a role, as routine vaccinations among diphtheria among military recruits only began in 1990. So they were not vaccinated and on the move. Soldiers were not, of course, not the only people on the move. The breakup of the Soviet Union sparked significant migration in general, coupled with severe shortages of vaccine in the newly independent states in the early 90s, as supplies were cut from Russia. So that it was also a question of centralized infrastructure where the antitoxin and the vaccine was coming from. There was a breakdown of public health services and healthcare in the reorganization, and difficulties in acquiring reagents for laboratory testing. These all contributed to the crisis and provided fertile ground for an outbreak. In many ways, the outbreak in the former Soviet Union was a watershed event in the European epidemic management of diphtheria. It brought to focus the frailty of public health systems in the face of political breakdown, and the force with which long forgotten diseases can reemerge with dwindling of vaccination rates. Moreover, diphtheria did not disappear with the end of the epidemic and the political crisis. Relatively high incidence rates of the disease that remained to circulate in Latvia and Lithuania served as mementos of the outbreak nearly 20 years on. The epidemic also put into motion institutional frameworks. The European Laboratory Working Group on Diphtheria, initiated by the WHO Regional European Office, began to work in '93 and expanded into the European Diphtheria Surveillance Network in 2006, and was then transferred to the ECDC. In other ways, so there was an infrastructural change, But the epidemic did not bring much change to the rest of Europe. Apart from small and isolated outbreaks in the mid-1980s in Italy, Portugal, and Germany, European incidence rates of diphtheria had been consistently low for the last 35 years. The sustained absence of the disease that followed the inclusion of diphtheria vaccines in national immunization programs in the mid-20th century then had profound effects on antitoxin production. While in the early 20th century, respective national institutions and companies produced the serum, in the second half of the century, sites of production were reduced to a handful of countries, Poland, Yugoslavia, Switzerland, which produced enough sera to meet international export demands. By the beginning of 2000s, hardly any European countries produced antitoxin for export, and stocks began to disappear from countries where diphtheria has been sporadic or absent. And there's an overall lack of antitoxin, and their consequences began to appear at the end of the decade, resulting in several deaths. In France in 2008, where it took 4 days to procure antitoxin from Brazil, or Lithuania, where public health authorities did not succeed to acquire it at all. And even in the 2010s, there have been several cases of death, partly because of the lack of diagnosis and late diagnosis and the lack of the serum. And yet the lesson of diphtheria has gone largely unheeded. Most of the scientific discussion following the outbreak instead has been limited to problems of immunization, coverage, methods, and vaccines. In the immediate aftermath, little attention or analysis was devoted to questions of treatment and access on the old drug. This lopsided attention to prevention at the cost of treatment is neither surprising nor peculiar to diphtheria. Instead, it tells us of a shift in perceptions and meanings of disease as they become memories rather than clinical realities in the post-vaccination era. As the case of the major diphtheria outbreak demonstrates, endings need to be maintained, and political instability and the mass movement of people almost inevitably lead to a breakdown of maintenance as well. Outbreaks of war are nearly always accompanied by outbreaks of disease. Wars and epidemics thus have a long history together in more ways than one. When discussed as social phenomena, government and political commentators often use military metaphors, likening the crisis to a fight against an invisible enemy that will not only bring casualties and demand sacrifice from society, but also promise an eventual closure akin to D-Day or a peace treaty. Boris Johnson and the Queen of England, for instance, conjured images of World War II to mobilize the population during the first lockdown in Britain in 2020. The enemy was invisible, and Britons were called on to embrace the Blitz spirit. NHS staff was quickly represented as fighting in the front line, and the Queen reached back to an iconic World War II song to encourage people to persist what will surely be a triumphant end. We will meet again. Boris Johnson, who has been famously positioning himself as a new Churchill, although quite possibly the worst man for the job, clearly took advantage politically of this opportunity. We could see very similar statements and approaches in the United States, as images of war and heavily doctored memories of World War II were utilized to mobilize cooperation and position politicians as exceptional statesmen in crisis. Viktor Orbán, Hungarian Prime Minister, stated in 2020 that infection equals an attack and declared the war on no less than 4 fronts against the coronavirus, involving military, police, healthcare, and economic fronts. Campaigns against infectious diseases tend to be discussed in military terms and work with an assumption that both epidemics and wars must have a singular endpoint. We approach the peak as if it was a decisive battle or a diplomatic arrangement. Yet the chronology of the single decisive ending is not always true, even for military history. More than 3 months separated the end of the Second World War in Europe, formalized by VE Day, from the end experienced in the broader Pacific theater as VJ Day, let alone the end experienced by the last Japanese soldier to lay down arms in 1974, after nearly 30 years in hiding in a remote Pacific island. For occupied countries like Japan, Germany, and Austria, the end of the war had a different temporality as well. By the time Austria signed World War II peace treaty in 1955, the Korean military operations had already ceased, after a 53 armistice, yet there's still no peace treaty between North and South. Just as a clear ending of a military war does not necessarily bring to close the experience of war in everyday life, so too the resolution of an epidemic does not immediately undo everything around the epidemic that involves. In the course of World War II, historians have calculated that 60 million people were displaced in Europe alone, among them Holocaust survivors, prisoners of war, refugees, and deportees. 2 years later, there were still close to 1 million people stranded in displaced person camps, the last of which closed only in 1959. Returning to normal life for people in their home countries also took time. Rationing food in Britain went on until 1954, nearly a decade after the last military battle. The images that national leaders and many others have drawn on then are highly imaginary, and they are not new, but they have further normalized and permeated public discourse on disease, and the fight against the pandemic has now slipped into an actual destructive war that is inevitably caught up in the crisis of the pandemic. It is not inevitable that this coupling is necessarily destructive itself, but the dangers of this conflation is very clear. And I'd like to show a counterpoint to this. And this is probably, I can never resist showing this quote because it's probably my most favorite quote of all time. Military and metaphors and wars on disease could, in a very interesting and important way, deflect from the actual war going on in the late 1950s and 60s. At the 5th International Polio Conference in 1960 in Copenhagen, Basil O'Connor, who was president of the American National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, celebrated the achievements of the cooperation between East, Soviet Union, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the West, the United States, in his opening speech. I quote, "This is a council not of war, but of victory. Together we have successfully created weapons against the common enemy that bring within our reach a triumph for all mankind, the coming elimination of epidemic paralytic poliomyelitis. We meet now to compare notes on what we have created, to report our experiences and to help each other in reaching decisions on the most effective use of those weapons. Your very presence here from the East, from the West, is proof to the world that in your high calling, in search for the truth that frees men from disease, there is no Cold War. One cannot escape the language used here and not connected with the concurrent escalating nuclear armament race, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto published in 1955 and the establishment of the Pugwash conferences in 1957, in which scientists called for an assessment of the dangers of the weapons they have created and called for an international peaceful resolution of the conflict. In a hopeful moment, the future imagined by these actors, even if only remaining at the level of rhetoric, was one where ending diseases would create a space of peace and cooperation, and after the end, thus represented one without a Cold War. An overall representation of pandemic response as a fight against the disease pathogens in a framework of us and them, and vaccines as weapons that protect the body of the intruder virus is not without its dangers, of course. For one, the war metaphor plays on idealized images of not only war itself, but of peace also. In a fight where healthcare workers were presented as heroes for whom nations clapped, the idea of the victorious peace, where friends and families separated by stringent lockdowns and they would sing together, the realities of hell and wars actually play out and end, do not fit. Perhaps those realities are even closer together, war and pandemic, than politicians and popular representations intended. Wars are rarely quick and always terrible, and they don't necessarily end with triumph. The end of World War II that Johnson and politicians reached back to was just as messy and long as the end of a pandemic. Aspiring to an ending akin to wars relegated the experience of war and thus epidemic COVID-19 itself into a constrained time, cutting it off from after. So I would say that it creates a very condensed and very concrete category and very narrow category of what an epidemic is and what a war is. Of course, these thoughts are, hardly new. Anthropologist Emily Martin, in the face of the HIV crisis, has famously argued that the metaphors used in immunology are far from self-evident and themselves are cultural and political products, these military metaphors. The representation of immunity as a military operation or police surveillance can work against ideas that are working towards the end of disease. In conflicts and in worlds where vaccines are weapons, people might push back against vaccination and connect them immediately to ideas of a repressive state or foreign power that aims to undermine society and political structures, just to see them as weapons. We can see plenty of these examples in theories that range from the United States, the Soviet Union, in the Cold War era. This is not new to our time. In recent decades in northern Nigeria, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, particularly, and this is connected to polio vaccination, since vaccination was used as a pretext in the identification of Osama bin Laden, proving to many that the fears were indeed justified. Military metaphors that conjure particular ideas of masculinity has also been present in treatment. It is enough to think of people who have lost the fight with cancer or emerged victorious, or in the immediate post-war era, were encouraged to fight polio and succeed in their treatment like soldiers. Once this narrative steps out of time with the end of disease, it further affects patient experience. Through analysis of polio narratives, Amy Fairchild and Danielle Wilson have respectively argued that for many, the onset of post-polio syndrome decades later, in which some of the symptoms of the disease come back, contested past experiences of conquering the disease, either through particular ideas of masculinity or through engaging with role models such as Roosevelt. The unexpected return of a disease experience and the frustrations it had created exposed the temporal situatedness of the meanings of polio. As of now, in April 2022, epidemics and wars have collided in very concrete ways. The pandemic is now on hold, said Pavlo Kovtoniuk, former Deputy Health Minister of Ukraine, in a recent conversation we had about pandemic and war. Time, as framed by the routines of every day, which was suspended by the pandemic, had transformed even more drastically and entirely suspended in an overlapping crisis of destruction. This is one way that epidemics might end. The possible victims of the coronavirus blending in with victims of shootings and bombings, impossible to tell apart, the disease becoming invisible in smoke and chaos. But we know historically that outbreaks of wars and unrest inevitably come with outbreaks of disease. Most recently, in 2014, Ukraine saw an outbreak of polio, a disease that had long been gone from the region. There are important implications of the framing of epidemics and disease along the lines of the internal, external, the us and them. We see this play out in terrifying ways as the perceived solution to the invasion of Ukraine seems to be increasingly the eradication of its people. Through the analysis of Nazi medicine, Robert Proctor and Paul Weinling and others have elaborated on the utilization of medical metaphors as tools of political, social, and economic exclusion, and eventually justification for genocide. Groups of people represented as a danger to the body politic has fueled xenophobia, anti-immigration measures for a long time. And this goes back, it's enough to think of the multiple names syphilis had over centuries, the French disease, the Spanish disease, the Italian disease, depending on who was the most hated national enemy from which vantage point. And we can see traces of this coupling of the other and the diseased regularly. As the mass movement of people under crowded and often unsanitary conditions inevitably lead to outbreaks of certain diseases, in this pandemic moment, the danger of conflating refugees moving through Europe with the threat of disease. While we have seen an initial support from refugees in most of the continent, and of course to certain refugees, as others have been integrated explicitly into the us and them internal-external framework a while ago, there are already signs of the limits of this welcome. For instance, when it comes to the realization that a high number of people who had to flee are indeed unvaccinated against COVID-19. And so you have these situations where people are offering their homes for refugees all across Europe, only to learn that these people are unvaccinated and closing their doors instead. There's a real danger then of thinking about the pandemic as war and along military metaphors, especially when many countries are relaxing regulations and many citizens considering the pandemic to be over. The frustration, again, with the conflation of the contested and drawn out ending of the pandemic and the drawn out war, which even upon ending, will see millions displaced for potentially many years, if not decades, can easily lead to the reemergence of well-known tropes of the inherently pathological refugees and migrants. Again, the coupling of war metaphors and infectious disease in an actual war is not inevitable. Incredibly, and as a Hungarian, I may say shockingly, horrifyingly and outrageously, Viktor Orbán has quickly turned to be a tacit and unspoken apologist for the invasion and danced back from being ready to fight on multiple fronts. The rhetoric coming up to the recent elections was one seeking peace. This is somebody else's war. We're not going to be involved. I will not go into the analysis of how Orbán has been navigating the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war's overall effect on illiberal leaders across the world. There are plenty much more qualified people to address this important question. However, the contrast between the heavy-handed war rhetoric against the disease and a sudden U-turn when it comes to actual conflict merits at least attention. And if we have, I'm going to finish soon, but if we have 1 second, the TB is a particularly interesting and important question when it comes to Ukraine. It's one of the, Ukraine has had one of the highest antibiotic resistant TB cases in the world. And it's in European and regional comparison, it has very, very high rates of TB, which had, obviously the war has had a devastating effect on, partly because it has cut off people from their treatment, which throws into danger the further development of antibiotic resistant strains, but also for the individual people to carry on with their treatment. And as they are traveling to Europe, there is, how do you, we come to the question of how do you match these kind of crisis moments with infrastructure that is not necessarily designed for these crisis moments, or the crisis is thought to be elsewhere. And TB, of course, is particularly interesting in terms of temporality, because we think about it often as something of the past. This is the microbiological past, right? This is something that is not part of our everyday. Of course, it is very much a huge problem, one of the biggest public health problems in the world, and also in Europe, in the United States, it depends on where you are, what kind of social standing you have, or social group you're part of, and so there is something very interesting and important going on, and TB is particularly connected with ideas of poverty and squalor, and also a kind of individual responsibility for maintaining the treatment and so on. So there is, I see this as a particularly kind of potentially dangerous way that it can play out in terms of, as these ideas couple. And just to conclude, when we imagine the future, perhaps one that entails the end of this specific pandemic and this specific war, it has become especially pertinent to critically assess their narratives and understand what the end is and what comes after. If we integrate the after into our historical or contemporary analysis, we can reassess what the categories are that we're looking at. What is an epidemic? Where are its borders? And what we consider to be part of it and what falls out of that category. The diversity of epidemic and pandemic endings of the past can be instructive, highlighting unintended consequences, problems contained in definitions of success in epidemic management, and point to the potential of increasing inequalities and marginalization of various geographies, social groups, and medical practices. Moreover, if we focus our attention to the after and approach the epidemic timeline from that vantage point, it will, as I said, can provide an opportunity to reconsider what our unit of analysis is and how we might refine it to be more inclusive. Finally, an attention to the epidemic narratives and their coupling and uncoupling with narratives of war need to be central to humanitarian response, policies regarding refugees, military aid, and public health in order to not further increase and perpetuate exclusion and suffering. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have some time for Q&A. Folks can please just wait until I give you the microphone so that everyone watching online can hear your questions. Any questions? Yes.
You use war as metaphor for pandemic, sort of. They look on pandemic in the sense that fight is war, right? So we can use as war now as metaphor of pandemic. And what happened in this case? What will be Russia? It would be Russia COVID that should be exterminated, or you need to kind of cure it somehow? Should you use the same terms? Kind of. It's one question. The second question is, when pandemic started, at least in the United States, but otherwise, many people do not believe it. Like maybe 50% of population say it's some fake. And the only way to make them believe, to make them dead. When they dying, they, okay, actually, maybe it's true. Not 100%, no, but
not
maybe.
even.
So many people in Russia do not believe that it's aggression of Russia to Ukraine. It's something else, whatever it is, it's hard to tell. So is it some measures that were used to make people believe to pandemic could be used people to believe to this aggression?
Thank you. Should I? Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's for the first question, that kind of highlights the problems of using these military metaphors and the pervasiveness of these military metaphors, because it can work all ways and every in many situations of conflict, and it's rarely helpful. There are ways in which it's helpful. It's very difficult to think of disease and immunity and epidemics and vaccination outside of that framework. It's so pervasive. So I usually have this exercise with my students to come up with, describe to me vaccination without using a single military metaphor, and it's incredibly difficult. But that that it works both ways is, and World War II is and the 1930s are very instructive in the extremes that it can facilitate by projecting this biological to the nations and people, and that's creating a unit of, yes, all Russians are infectious, of ideology, of malintent, of destruction. So that I think is a good point, that it's not a one-way thing, and it's not a question of good or bad, whatever side we're on in a given conflict. The other thing, I think that and I've been thinking about what is unique about this particular pandemic, that is different, that there is so much doubt of even the existence, and this is kind of somebody else's problem, right? That it's invisible. If you don't want it to be concerning you, you don't see it. But there is I think a change, obviously, in communication and social media, and a longer term of relativization of whatever, of truth, of scientific expertise, or expertise in general, of established institutions that had been standing, and that can be the same. It's part of the same package of the disbelief. there's also a visibility that is kind of unprecedented, I think, both in terms of research that has gone into COVID and understanding COVID and figuring out what this is was very visible to everyone. This is usually, you know, scientific journals, run of the mill, you know, I think most of all here, I did not go into the details of scientific knowledge production, but that became very visible. And I think that's what is undermining, because you can make visible everything and the opposite of it. So that is the key. I have no answer. If I knew how to how to convince people, then I would be probably doing something else at this point.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting, very informative. I was thinking actually, and while you were talking, about the very question of alternative narratives. I work on narratives, so that's not surprising. And one of the ones that I think it would be interesting to think about, so not the kind of war that we imagine World War II to be, but the existence over the entire 20th century of constant war. In different places and at lower levels, right? Not nuclear war, not entire continents, and that seems to be some parallel with what is tolerable in pandemics, and who will become sick, and it can be not my problem, so that there's a lower level of illness. All right. And there are all sorts of things like sickle cell anemia that simply just go on. Right. No one pays, no one who's not immediately involved pays attention to it in the rest of the world, and so on. So I wonder if you could just talk about that possibility of thinking. Also, people are talking about the fact that even with COVID, we might be getting vaccines every year the way we do for influenza, and it can be under control. Right? So not getting rid of it. It's a whole different way of thinking about illness. You don't get rid of it, you control it, but that just means other sorts of people get it.
Yeah,
So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you. That is such a great and such an important point. And it, I think one of the things where I think there is a severe problem in how we think about these epidemic narratives and how we frame them is really based on 20th century experience of these epidemics that are quite distinct, and you know, some are and are focused in attention. And then from the, well, HIV AIDS is a game changer, right? Because you also have this kind of sense of progress of the antibiotics, and you know, and the vaccines, and you know, it looks like for a while that, you know, like humanity's got it under control. There's nothing more to see here. And then especially the zoonotic diseases that start becoming visible again, but also because of, you know, environmental, the interaction of and the kind of industrialization and pushing boundaries of nature and animals and human coexistence becomes exactly what you described, this constant low-level wars that epidemics and outbreaks, that, and then some of them become really big and prominent, and you know, this might not be the big one, right? But that, so that there is I think a change in how what we see, and also I think a change in the pattern of epidemics with the emerging diseases, and a much more attention to this, these other things that are going on. But the narratives and that are informing the policies and the concepts are very much 20th century. So there's a kind of mismatch. So it would be, I think that's a great point to connect that 20th century with this 21st century, which is very similar. Thank you.
This question comes from Warwick Anderson.
Hi, Warwick.
Thanks, Dora. When you say the reduction of the disease / epidemic to the pathogen, do you mean to indicate a lack of ecological understanding of disease processes, an emphasis on contamination and specific ontology rather than on configuration, whether ecological or sociological? If so, how might an epidemic end ecologically? Or does end make no sense ecologically?
Quite possibly it doesn't make sense ecologically, would be my answer. What I talked about and looked at is the kind of representations that then inform and have an impact on the very real engagement of actors, may they be who are personally experiencing it, and policymakers, and it does reduce all kinds of complexities to that pathogen and that one thing. But that is because that is the ultimate aim in the end, because that's what you have in the end is the pathogen, that then creates this false sense of ending. So yes, I think that that is the pessimistic version and understanding of your question. But I have to think a bit more about that, because I think especially thinking more about zoonotic diseases and expanding the analysis of this framework, I think will bring in even richer and more complex understanding of these endings, which I fear may be even more troubling than now. But thank you for the question. I'll try to come back to you in 8 years, if possible.
Thank you for the lecture. If I understood you correctly, you said that as sort of the pandemics, epidemics move to their end or are perceived to be ending, societies move away from focusing on therapeutics towards prevention. And if I understood this correctly, do you see this at work now? Because like my general impression is rather that society tries to forget about both therapeutics and prevention, thinking of all the lifting of mask mandates, but also especially about the several European states walking back initiatives for compulsory vaccination. So that's my question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, in short, I think there is a walking away from both, but there is still a continued emphasis on vaccination, and the aims are to increase the effectiveness of vaccines, and as Susan said, introduce the yearly, annual, preventative measures. What is falling away, I think, or there is a high risk, is long COVID. It becomes manageable in some way, but failings and reminders of pandemics and epidemics, when nobody wants to stay in it anymore. Everybody wants to forget and move on. But these, the people who have long COVID or the symptoms that one might experience are pulling it back to that kind of other temporal structure that is not letting go. And that becomes uncomfortable to consider, and that becomes kind of erased with that, because we're over it now. it shouldn't be part of it anymore. But I mean, I have no idea where this the COVID thing will go. The prevention that we're, the mask mandates and so on are very much that kind of society level, not biotechnological preventions that we have, that we're familiar with from earlier ends of epidemics. So it's a question of how that, comes and stays with us. What are that? What part of it will integrate? I mean, it's interesting. The mask mandate was lifted in Germany, where I live, a couple of weeks ago. At the point where I came away, people were wearing masks almost just as before. Nothing really changed, because there was, it depends on the public health culture. It depends on what we understand as public health, right? Very different concepts in different areas. But that is also a kind of interesting after effect of this.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I was thinking as you were speaking about the use of narrative I'm sorry, I'm going to use military terms, but, to mobilize public attention, how important that was in the beginning of COVID to get people's attention, right? To tell stories, to show images, and to dramatize, I guess, the potential risk they faced. And so, maybe the problem is just that's just how we go about it. And even as we talked today here about the problem of believing that the end has come when it really hasn't, we kind of had to re-dramatize it. We had to tell stories of what happens when people make that mistake. And so it seems like a difficult loop to escape. But I just wonder your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's the interesting thing to me in this is the constant renegotiation of time and the narrative and the temporality as you're experiencing it. And in one way, it's a kind of looking back exercise, like that was the beginning. Remember 2020 when we were like, how that has how we structure that, which is very different than when we were in it. But then that kind of has to be reworked and reconfigured all the time. And there's always a kind of reflection looking back, but there's always so it's a constant retelling of stories until at certain points they ossify into something. I'm not exactly sure, what that point is when there is a clear narrative that crystallizes and that becomes stable. But then that is the moment when we really need to pay attention, because then we can see all these other narratives and all these other experiences that are pushed out of it. So I think that's kind of what I constantly find interesting, and I had to and I think these are questions that I haven't, because I started thinking about this as I said and thinking about epidemics for a long time, but it fundamentally changed. Being inside fundamentally changed of how I started seeing the past as well, and the questions asked. So
I was thinking, even with the poster, that we're this close, right? But that's an attempt to get people to contribute or to work harder. So the end point, the notion that you can reach that end is a kind of mobilizing device.
Yeah.
It seems to be important.
Yeah,
So
it is. I mean, yeah, it is has its utility, and I think it would be very difficult and possibly, I'm not sure. I mean, it would be pointless, but it's very difficult to do away, and I don't think that should be the goal with the narrative altogether. It's more of because that is without the prospect of ending, it's very difficult to not only mobilize, but to cope, right, with anything. So we need these hopes of ending and the goals of ending. It is, I think, the question is where, how we think about that ending and where we put that, that ending, is that part of the thing? Is that part of the unit? Or, we think of it as everything else. It comes as already outside of the unit, and to incorporate that rather than do away with it.
Yeah, we have to follow up.
So Warwick has a follow-up.
Oh, good. I knew he wouldn't let it slide.
Speaking of metaphors, is there still some hope for immunity despite Martin's characterization of it? I'm thinking of Esposito's notion of co-immunity, community, especially as taken up and elaborated by Nancy, Zizek, de Caesar, and Napier. An immunity that derives from the cooperation and altruism of the herd, as Trotter observed during and in spite of another war.
Thank you. That is such an excellent point, and that is exactly, I think, what is one of the alternative ways of thinking about it, and that also brings me back to the question of how we perceive, and that is at the heart of it, I think, how we perceive what public health is, and what that understanding is in a society. If it's a question of solidarity and collaboration and community, which is a particular understanding of it, and this is partly what I'm trying to now think about in a more structured way in other work that I'm doing. And this is actually one of the ways in which is a productive one. Not to mention that that according to I once took part in a conversation at the Oxford Vaccine Center, Martin School in Oxford, where interdisciplinary conversations pointed to the fact, and multiple quantitative and qualitative studies, that you cannot shift the vaccine resistance and hesitancy with facts or rational arguments, or even providing information. The only thing that seemed to have worked is the question of solidarity, of protecting other people and invoking that kind of community aspect. So I think that is a very, very important part of it, and that is something that could be mobilized. It's very difficult to get away from it in that kind of coupling of the military and the pandemic. So the war and the pandemic with these sense of community. So I'm in complete agreement, and thank you for bringing that to the conversation.
So what is the best strategy for viruses? Because we know all Darwin theory, right? So if virus kill the person, he also will be killed. Therefore, it should be evolved to some mild case that he can propagate more and indefinitely. So from this point of view, the deadly virus is actually a virus that soon will be eliminated.
I'm not a virologist, but the question, I think, is not the deadliness, but it can be deadly if it has enough time to if it's extremely infectious and can pass on quickly. That's the question. It reminds me of this game called Epidemic. It was the Plague Inc. Yes, which got me through finishing my dissertation a long time ago. And now it made a comeback. It was, and you have to be, you're the virus, and you have to kind of kill off humanity, and it's a very difficult thing to balance. But yeah, I think that that conveys again this kind of hope narrative of what, where is this going? What happens biologically? What would make sense for this entity, the virus, to fit into this narrative of playing out in this particular way? And that I think is the part of the issue with these current conversations around endemicity, which imply that it's kind of mild and not a problem. But of course, as we know, that's not necessarily the case.
I think, who was it? Warwick?
Warwick, yeah.
I like his questions very much, but if you'll permit me to say that there's more involved, because if solidarity is what is an answer, we have lots of people in the world, and Orban is one of them, but we have our own in the United States, who are actually creating both fear on the one hand and forgetting on the other. So I don't think that we can think about, and I'm curious about your opinion about this. I don't think we can think about the reactions to vaccination and the reactions to pandemic as immediate individual reactions. Right? So there's a social ecology to all of this. And so one question I wanted to ask you is the extreme politicization in all the Western countries of the current pandemic and masks and vaccinations and so on. Do you have good evidence about similar kinds of polarizations in previous pandemics? Because my sense is, I'm obviously not a historian of this, which is why I'm asking you. But my sense is that there's a huge amount of riding coattails. There's an awful lot of taking advantage of the actual disease process itself by politicians. You name whatever you want to name, but there's a manipulation of public opinion, as you were saying, public health opinion. And so I was wondering what your sense of that, and also whether this has been the case in past pandemics.
Well, I think that is incredibly constant, I guess, in over time, because it usually, I mean, it's very much visible when there is a particular blaming of certain social groups, or the HIV AIDS, the AIDS crisis in the 80s was a very case in point, and or the if there's some kind of shame attached to how it spreads, the particularities of diseases, and there is always I think because it's fundamentally on the one hand upends established routines and everydays and structures, and is disruptive. So there needs to be a very political engagement with it. But it also, because of this upturning, these events always bring to the front the underlying tensions that are already there in societies. So they don't necessarily, like, sometimes they create these tensions, but most of the time what we can see as a pattern is that they bring it really to the front. Either these can be constructive as well, so there can be ideas of reconfiguration coming to the fore. Maybe these are short-lived, or maybe they do achieve some kind of change, but there is a constant that kind of political engagement, or religious, churches from history of plague has a very strong and established history of this kind of religious engagement and the effect of that. So I think it's always there, when I was doing research on on polio, that was the surprise to me that I was looking for it. You know, okay, where is it coming? It's contagion. It's communism. It's, you know, it's all everywhere. Everybody's talking about, you know, the kind of invisible enemies and so on. And it wasn't there in that particular way. It was there in the sense that you know, everybody had to demonstrate how amazingly they are going to handle this, and so that kind of propelled collaboration because of the uncertainty, which is not happening, very different from what's happening right now. So yeah, I think that is a very important point. But I think, you know, with the going back to the community and the public, it's obviously a longer term, you know, to shift these kind of narratives and to shift these discourses is a very long term effect that has to, you know, that happens from, you know, talking to children and washing their hands and of conceiving of microbes. And this is kind of, you know, adding to my answer to Warwick's point about the community, is this: the microbes are us. So it's like that being you know, acknowledgement of that co-living and coexistence that also breaks down this us and them, an external internal boundary. It's partly living with it, but the acknowledgement that we're living with every, you know, thing, and our bodies are, you know, couldn't function without without microbes, and that is there is a particular ecology in that that is keeping up life, and this is part of it. So I think there are these different components of what can be productive, but of course that doesn't solve the question of Orban or the you know, very destructive ways in which it's used.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.